guilty about starting late. I know. He's like, I'm late for everything. Like it's a problem. Oh, and we're live. It is Thursday, January 27th, 5:05 p.m. Eastern time. And we're not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are allowed to talk about having a new democratically appointed Supreme Court justice on the bench with the recent announcement of Justice Breyer's retirement at the end of this term. And joining us today is both old hands at this show are Jamal Green, professor at Columbia, and newly tenured professor, Michigan Law School, Lieu Lippman. And the I think like has the court we were just discussing has the corner on pithy and witty and irreverent Supreme Court quotes printed onto various clothing paraphernalia. But it's so great to see both of you. This is such like an all-star conversation to be having. I mean, you were literally kind of the first two people I thought of. So thanks for coming back on.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
And congrats to you.
Yeah, congrats.
Thank you. I've fallen so far behind Scott Shapiro in lieu of fun appearances. I will never possibly be able to catch up, but I thought it was worth the old college try.
Yeah, you briefly overtook him, and then we made him a co-host, and so that's probably
nothing you can do about that.
So I want to start with telling you we were talking in the green room before, just like kind of where to start, and I know it's not really like necessarily the most logical place to start, but selfishly, I just kind of was curious. Whenever something like this happens, they bring in all these former clerks to talk about what's going on with the court and like to kind of like talk about the politics behind the scenes. And I was just kind of curious, like, how much is this type of decision? Do clerks generally know and gossip about this type of thing, or have like an idea that this is happening before the public knows? Or does it really vary from justice to justice? And I mean, I guess kind of related to that was like the Tubin leak. Do you think something that kind of created or instigated him announcing this when he announced it? I don't know, Leah, if you want to start, but Jamal, you can start too.
I guess I'm kind of skeptical that, law clerks know these kind of retirement announcements in advance of when they happen. It is possible that in conversations with the justice, as they kind of happen naturally, just in like staying in touch and whatnot, someone might get a sense about, how they're feeling about, the world, their work at any particular moment. But I'm not sure that law clerks have any particular insight into a justice's retirement decisions in advance. I don't think that's really something that the justices kind of like give their clerks a heads up about. Although like people might have an intuition one way or another just by virtue of like getting to know them, by working for them for a year. So I guess I don't really think it, is something that is discussed among kind of clerk groups. The Tubin thing is fascinating because he suggested last week that a Breyer retirement was imminent, and everyone kind of dismissed it when he said it, and it didn't happen.
Well, he's a little bit persona non grata.
Well, it didn't happen like within 24 to 48 hours of him announcing it. And he said, I'm going to discuss this on CNN. And then he goes on CNN and, Breyer doesn't retire. And so we're all sitting around thinking, well, okay, does he mean at the end of the term? And we've just kind of written this off. And then all of a sudden, a week later, it happens. And so, I wonder if he received some inklings, but didn't have the kind of confirmation that would fly in order to run the story in the same way that, Pete Williams later got, but that, the inklings that again were the basis of, the actual planned retirement, he got some wind of, but again, didn't have the kind of sourcing that would allow him to say definitively Justice Breyer is going to retire. I don't know.
Yeah, I think all of that is right. I think it's, I don't know the degree to which other justices, clerks, know in advance at all about retirements. If they do, I think it's very unlikely that they would be the ones to leak that to the press or someone else. They have a lot at stake in not pissing off their justice, and so I think it's unlikely to have come from a clerk. If I'm guessing how this gets to Tubin, it's, Justice Breyer has a lot of friends, and Tubin's a very well connected reporter, and someone he knew, over a drink, or in a moment of more candor than he should have had, said, "Oh, I think this is going to happen." And then Tubin, knowing that it was likely to happen regardless of whether he had heard the leak or not, and that he's on pretty safe ground, that Breyer will retire at some point before the midterms, said, I'm going to run with this. That's my guess, but who knows?
Could I just add one other possibility?
Yeah, sure.
So Justice Breyer was in the habit of going out to lunches with clerks. There's this tradition at the Supreme Court where you go out to lunch with all of the different justices. So the law clerks for Justice Kagan will go out to lunch with Justice Breyer, and then they'll later go out to lunch with Justice Sotomayor, so on and so forth. And Justice Breyer would take all of the law clerks to the same place, Montmartre, and he would loudly discuss the court's pending cases with them. And he didn't.
It's like a good place to hang out.
Exactly,
if you're a reporter.
Intend to publicize secret or non-public information about the court, but he liked to talk about the court's business with clerks, and he oftentimes did so, or at least not, or more than once, would do so in public spaces. I don't know that that's more likely than what Jamal hypothesized, but it's a non-zero possibility.
Yeah. No, totally. Go ahead, Genevieve.
One of the more recent things that I, just as an observer of the court, and have obviously no experience with it, but his description of his clerks being busy beavers during oral argument was very endearing. Is there any memory that any of you have as your time of clerking that is especially fond of your judge or justice?
Of our own judge? Many. I will say something just to keep it on Breyer for the moment. I love Justice Stevens, who I clerk for, but Justice Breyer required a lot of his clerks, right? So clerks generally have to write bench memos for justices, although Justice Stevens did not require them. Justice Breyer did, and they'd be long and involved, and he would be very engaged in research, and his clerks were like working all the time, is my recollection. I don't know if Leah had the same experience, but he was very reliant on his clerks, but not in the way that, it wasn't that he was lazy and was just sort of relying on their labor or something. It was that he was really engaged and really wanted to know a lot about the record and wanted to know a lot of relevant facts, and so he needed help with that. But that if I think about his chambers, it was like a very, very hardworking, really busy chambers.
Yeah. Leah, I was going to ask, I wanted to kind of bring us back to, I'm going to put it into the chat, the Washington and Post op-ed that you wrote. And I'm kind of very curious, do you think that, obviously he wants kind of, there's politics at play here. That seems very obvious, but what the tipping point was for right this moment in this term versus next year versus the year after, you're obviously saying that he's avoiding the mistake of Ginsburg. Do you really think that Ginsburg's decision not to retire is like almost tarnishing her legacy in a sense, and that's what he's trying to avoid? Or do you think that is it a personal decision about legacy basically, or is it about the actually like the outcome of the court and wanting to like ensure that the liberal justices count is preserved?
I don't know that I can, offer a definitive guess about, what the precise motivations of Justice Breyer are, or how he might view, Justice Ginsburg's replacement, with Justice Barrett. But I do think, announcing in January is a little bit atypical, odd timing. The last few justices who have announced in advance at the end of the term when they've said we're retiring, at the end of the term, were Justice Stevens and Justice Souter, both of whom announced in April. And then Justice Kennedy, of course, announced on the very last day of the Supreme Court's term in June. It's possible that Justice Breyer honestly didn't plan to release this information until later, and it got out ahead of him, as we were suggesting earlier. It's also possible he wanted to give, the Senate and the president a lot of time to vet a nominee, a lot of time to hold hearings, and have a confirmation happen before the end of the term, so the new justice is ready to go. Any of those things are possible. The point I made in the Washington Post piece about Justice Ginsburg is just that her decision not to retire, when Democrats held the presidency and the Senate, has been kind of revealed to be hugely disastrous and hugely consequential for a lot of people. People in Texas are the second most populous state, are not able to access safe and legal abortions because Justice Barrett, rather than Justice Ginsburg, is now on the Supreme Court. And there's just no getting around that consequence, given the vote breakdown in the SB 8 cases. So, I don't know that her decision is going to affect how people think about her many years after, or her legacy in that sense. But I think, seeing the consequences of that decision play out so pointedly and so quickly, on an issue that was so important to Justice Ginsburg, it would be hard to ignore as that's happening right in front of you. And you are watching it play out.
Do you agree with that, Jamal? Or
yeah, I mean, as with Leah, I wouldn't want to go too far towards armchair speculation. Though I think there are what I'll say is I think there are a lot of different data points that one could point to if you want to engage in armchair speculation. Obviously, the thought of retirement has been, in his mind for a very long time, right? So I wouldn't assume that there's any particular event that is what caused him to make this decision. He may have well made this decision 6 months ago, for all I know. But I will say, there are a few things that, about the timing of this that, if you did want to speculate, one is the OSHA vaccine or test case a couple of weeks ago, where at oral argument, Justice Breyer seemed, I'll say, more exasperated than he normally does with the other justices and their resistance to what he understood to be sort of ordinary administrative decision making. He is someone who really cares about the administrative state and the power of the administrative state to use its expertise to govern effectively. And this was sort of what I think anyone with his set of views would view as a just completely, I'll just say, hackery, right? In terms of how the court comes out here. This is the exact opposite of where someone like Justice Breyer would sit in terms of what an agency should be allowed to do in the face of a surrounding emergency. So, maybe, there's something about the brazenness of the majority opinion that may have said, there's only so long you can sort of keep the politics out of this institution, and I've got to, do my part. The court, it happened very recently, but he would have known for some time that the court was about to take this Harvard affirmative action case and this UNC affirmative action case. These are going to be very, very important cases, are argued at the beginning of the next term. He knows he's going to be replaced by an African-American woman. You might want to make sure that person has as much ramp as possible towards those cases. So any number of little things. Of course, none of us can get inside his head, and I think it is a little presumptuous to assume, he just decided last week whether to retire or not. But there are some hints for people to speculate about on Twitter or whatever.
So Leah has to, sorry, Judy, I just realized that Leah has to jump off soon. But so before she goes, I wanted to kind of quickly ask, Leah, you have been one of my favorite people to follow, also because you talk about, you put up my friends' names when you're posting people, the people I went to law school with. I'm yes, they should be a judge when you're talking about nominees for the bench. And I couldn't agree more with some of the people that you put up. But who do you, if you had to kind of name some forerunners, is like the names that you're seeing, are they the same names? Are you seeing, do you have, what are you thinking that who the people are going to be?
I think the names that people are talking about are the ones that are going to end up being nominated to the Supreme Court. I think it will be either Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, who was recently appointed to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, or Justice Leandra Kruger, who is an associate justice on the California Supreme Court. I think either of them would be terrific justices. Both of them would bring, a lot of professional diversity, a lot of firsts to the court. Justice Kruger was the first Black woman to be editor-in-chief of the Yale Law Journal. She would be, a rare justice coming from a state Supreme Court.
I was just going to say that. That's actually what I was kind of thinking was so remarkable, too.
She's 45. She argued a bunch of cases in the Solicitor General's office. She was suggested as a possible nominee to be Solicitor General of the United States. People think extremely highly of her. And Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson was a public defender before, she became a federal judge. There is no one who has represented indigent criminal defendants on the Supreme Court right now. She's worked on the Sentencing Commission. She actually clerked for Justice Breyer. Leandra Kruger also clerked on the Supreme Court for Justice Stevens, like Jamal. But so both of them would bring, some new perspectives to the court, some additional, professional experiences that are lacking on the Supreme Court right now. And both of them are just extremely smart, skilled lawyers. And, I think should be easily confirmed. And I think it's going to be, one of them.
I that's my inclination. And you've been hearing about the double switch of Kamala Harris, obviously, as a possibility. But I think that's, besides the crazy, like kind of like the logistics of that and the appearance of that being very difficult. One of the things that has struck me is the likelihood of it putting an ADA a DA, like basically on the court seems not like the move right now. And the other person that you've been hearing that isn't a justice is Cheryl Eiffel. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were about non-justice nominees generally.
I think Cheryl Eiffel would be a transformational justice and an amazing justice. She is, of course, the current and soon-to-be outgoing president and director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Justice Thurgood Marshall, who was the first, Black justice, was, of course, also, the former director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And I think it would be really amazing for the first Black woman, justice to also come from LDF. Sherilyn is a fantastic advocate, intellect. She has done some amazing work kind of exposing, the history of lynchings and the frequency with which lynchings were happening at public offices, that again would bring, a kind of expertise that, the current justices just do not have. And, I think she would be wonderful. But I think just realistically, it is more likely to be someone who is a current judge. There used to be, a wonderful tradition of frequently appointing justices who weren't sitting judges. And of course, Justice Kagan was appointed, when she was not currently a judge. So it's not out of the question, but it does seem more likely that would be either Justice Kruger or Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, even though I think obviously Sherilyn would be a wonderful Supreme Court justice. But it does seem to be, there are other nominees who, are already judges and, also, yeah.
One of the things also that was notable, especially during the press conference, was that it seemed like this is an attempt to reset the normative values of how an appointment process is supposed to go. So we have this announcement of a retirement. There's I believe President Biden said that by the end of February, he'd like to have his nominee stated, and then he would theoretically then have them go through the process of getting the advice and consent of the Senate. Now, how much of this do you guys think is just trying to lay out a very clear plan so that if there's any reaction from the, or first of all, trying to get it before midterms, and then secondly, trying to reset the disruptions that we saw with the past two nominations? That got a little muddled.
No, I think it's fine. Leah,
So
I don't know when you have to
Leah
go
wants
off.
to jump in before she leaves, but
Yeah.
Oh, sure. I'll just say something quickly. I think they will try to do this before the midterms. I think they will successfully do it before the midterms. I hope that they will, get this started kind of before the end of the Supreme Court term. But a part of me also really hopes that this does not detract from their ability to fill the existing vacancies on the Federal Court of Appeals and district courts as well. As to whether this will restore a degree of normalcy to Supreme Court confirmations, I am not holding out hope, just because I think the new norm that has been established is, when the president and the Senate are the same party, the president gets to, select a Supreme Court justice, but when they're not, they can't. I don't doubt that Senate Republicans are probably going to try to delay this process. We already have Senator Susan Collins suggesting that they shouldn't follow the timeline that Republicans followed for Justice Barrett. Of course, Democrats just hold a 50-50 majority with VP Harris able to break ties in the Senate, which might limit their ability to kind of move, more quickly. But, I think that they will be able to get it done before the midterms. And I hope they are, able to get it kind of squared away before the end of the term, which, as Justice Breyer's letter of retirement suggests, like he kind of wants a successor to be nominated, confirmed before the end of the term, so that when the term happens, right, he can retire and that person can replace him.
Yeah, absolutely.
Leah,
I'll just say I let you go because I don't want to shove you away, but I also don't want to you promised us a couple 20 to 30 minutes, so I don't want to force you to do anything if you have other things to be on. But I'm also very interested to hear what Jamal thinks about that question, especially also given the fact that I think you tweeted just before you came on the show about how it was fairly weird that the executive office the executive was having this press conference with the justice at the White House.
So I don't know that it's weird in that it's unusual. I don't know how I think my recollection is that it's a bit unusual that most announcements happen with a note sent to the president from the justice, and there's no particular press conference or anything like that. I did send a tweet out because I was reminded of something that Justice Stevens was very focused on, which is and has become a tradition and remains a tradition that when justices are confirmed, they get sworn in at the White House, and he always thought that was sort of weird. That's
right. It's the swearing in.
Once you become a justice, you should send the message that we are no longer connected to the White House in any way, and I think that's the right message to send, and I think it's the right message to send at the moment of retirement too, insofar as retirement is sort of the flip side of we have this one of the traditions we now have is you pick your replacement ideologically. I think that's a pretty unseemly tradition. You can't unilaterally disarm from it, right? So I'm not blaming Justice Breyer, right? But it does remain a little bit unseemly that you sort of tie your retirement to the president in some particular way. On the timing, I totally agree with Leah that there'll be enough time to have this process, or should be enough time to have this process well before the midterms. It wouldn't surprise me if that was itself a factor in the retirement happening at this moment, right? So that you don't have to have a rushed process. And Justice Breyer, wrote this book about the relative absence of politics at the court, and if his legacy was another sort of super rushed confirmation process to get it in under the wire before the election, I would think that he would find that distasteful. So he does, by doing this in January, he gives enough time for the Senate to have a normal process if they want to.
Yeah, Leah, I don't know if you have time to answer this, but we were talking really briefly in the green room also about kind of this new the Rosemary Pooler and Jose Cabranes's decision to retire simultaneously, and to kind of with the purpose of kind of having a sense of who their replacements were going to be, or at least kind of a sense of who would be appointing them, and that they would be assured of before they left. It was almost conditional. It wasn't, I don't remember the exact language, but I remember kind of being surprised by it. And it seemed like a bold and kind of new move. And I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are on, and whether kind of things like that happening that was in the Second Circuit, things like that happening in the Second Circuit kind of are responsive to all of the political jockeying around the Supreme Court as well.
We've also seen that elsewhere. I think there was a Seventh Circuit judge who indicated that they would retire, but then rescinded it when, the White House wasn't going to select the former clerk. I think that that level of being involved in picking your successor is different in kind and in degree than what Jamal was referencing, picking the president who would pick your successor and picking them ideologically.
Yes,
so
totally.
That I think is several bridges too far, and definitely inappropriate. And I just very much doubt and cannot imagine that Justice Breyer would engage in that behavior, or President Biden would as well. Ruth Marcus in her book Supreme Ambition, suggested Justice Kennedy did engage in that behavior, and suggesting that he wanted it to be, now Justice Kavanaugh who would replace him, and the White House kind of signaling that, like, yeah, it's going to be him, influence his decision to retire. I just don't think Justice Breyer, that is part of the calculus. I mean, again, he knows who's on the short list. He's seen comments, but I don't imagine that he is having conversations and sitting down with the White House along the lines of, well, if it's going to be this person, we'll go. But on that note, I really need to leave. Thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry, Jamal, I was talking so much because I was only going to be here for a short amount of time, but it was really great to see all of you.
Yeah. It was great to see you too, Leah. See you soon.
Bye.
So, Jamal, what's your impression of that? I mean, I agree with Leah completely. Like, I think it's a very strange thing to kind of start doing, which is, it is definitely one thing to kind of pick the picker, but a different thing to pick your successor directly, or to try to exercise some level of control over it. And I'm curious whether that's like your thought process as well.
So I think what Leah is referring to in terms of rescinding your retirement if the person you like isn't picked, I think that's clearly beyond the pale. I don't think that that's likely to be what's happening with Judge Cabranes and Judge Pooler on the Second Circuit. It's not that unusual, and there are some historical examples to say for a judge to say, I'll stay on until the confirmation of my successor, and that makes a lot of sense in this day and age, when there's now a stronger, or I should say a weaker norm of sort of automatically or giving substantial deference to the president and picking a judge. If it might be months or years, right, until there's a successor, it's seemed perfectly reasonable to say, look, I'm going to stick around. So, don't think you can have an 8-member court if it happens that, the demise of a single Democratic senator changes the Senate, right? So I don't find it so strange in the context of our times. Although, again, if it really were about picking a specific person, that would be problematic. But I don't believe that's what's happening here.
Yeah, I agree. I'm curious. We know that he's announced that it's going that the successor will be a Black woman, which is great. But there's been also a lot of talk about kind of the religious makeup of the Supreme Court, and I'm curious if you think that this is as much of an issue as people have been long discussing, the Catholic Jewish kind of breakdown and the lack of Protestant kind of representation. Do you think that like, we talk about, like, we talk about, there is a theory of that, like, you should leave your politics at the table, and of course that you should leave your religious affiliation at the table. But do we, especially as we're continuing to see these kinds of religious liberty cases and cases around women's right to choose, like, this seems like these are intractable with some of these, some of the religious affiliation of these judges. So, I mean, do you have any thoughts?
I think a general commitment to diversity along a number of dimensions, including religion, is a laudable thing for a Supreme Court. So, the fact that there's one Protestant on the court, and that's Gorsuch, who is an Episcopalian, I believe, is certainly odd given the makeup of the country. But to be honest, I'm not sure that I see this. It's not clear to me what it has to do substantively with the cases the court decides, right? So, Yes, there are.
But it could influence the ones they select, though. No.
I mean, sure. I mean, any number of experiences can influence, and I don't. Again, I don't doubt that religion is an important formative part of people's experience. So I do think that, as with any other form of diversity, as with many other forms of diversity, something as constitutive as religion, I think, is important. I just hesitate to draw straight lines, as I would with race as well. But I feel hesitant to draw straight lines and say, because they've got all these Catholic justices, they're going to decide religion cases in a particular way. The reason a bunch of justices on the current court are very in favor of religious liberty is because they have a certain view, right? That view is not necessarily tied to their, Joe Biden's a practicing Catholic as well, but he has a different set of views, right? So I'm hesitant to draw a straight line, but I do think, I think diversity is important. I think having people from different religious traditions, especially represented within the country, is an important thing, including non-religious traditions as well.
Yeah. Judy, if I want to give you the chance to ask, but I also see a baby on your lap, so I'm happy to keep going.
No, we have some great questions. I think it would be really wonderful.
Okay,
to bring Richard
awesome.
up.
Oh, actually, I think I'm gonna go to Jack first. Jack, welcome to In Lieu of Fun, and great question. The floor is yours.
So I had two questions. The first one was kind of simple and was more of a Leah Littman question, I think, which is when Justice Thomas or Justice Alito is going to insert "Let's Go Brandon" into one of their opinions.
That is a Leah Littman question.
The more involved question is that people think that anyone careerist enough to want to be interested in a position on the Supreme Court would take it under any circumstances. And the question is, does the prospect of writing or signing on to only dissents in all of the big cases for the foreseeable future take any of the shine off of the position for prospective candidates?
That's a great question.
Wow. I think that is a great question, and one that's been, that may not have been really on the table until very recently. Even when there was there'd been a conservative majority in the court for my whole lifetime. But the extent of it today, and the fact that a number of those people are quite young and will be on the court for a long time, I think does raise that issue. It's hard to. I think you're right that for the kinds of lawyers who find themselves in the position of being considered for a Supreme Court justice, it's one of these things where their whole life it's been clear to them that they would not turn that position down. I do think it might. I think it's more likely to influence how long someone stays in the court than whether they take the position in the first place. Things can change very quickly. This is something that we forget, and I think people on the progressive side feel very despairing right now. But they also felt very despairing right before Justice Scalia passed away, and then they got very ecstatic for 3 weeks or something, and then they realized that it wasn't going to go the way they thought. But I can certainly imagine if you're part of the three of a 6-3 court for 15 years, 20 years, seeking that out for 30 or 35 or 40 years seems to me something that is a unique form of torture. And if you're not actually making law, if you're just sort of expressing yourself, but at some point you've expressed yourself as much as you're going to. So I think that might be something to look out for, and look out for with people like Justice Sotomayor and Justice Kagan as well. And see if there's a Democratic president and a Democratic Senate, and they still are in the minority like this. Certainly wouldn't surprise me if they didn't stick around as long as a Justice Stevens or as a William O. Douglas did. Yeah,
so you and Leah were talking before about, and I wanted to ask this question then, but we got kind of sidetracked about Breyer being like a little annoyed in oral arguments and kind of a little bit testy. And Nina Totenberg, I think, was on strict scrutiny and talked about it as well. But do you think there's a sense that maybe he's not, and I don't know this, like once you're in this position and it's so there's so much wrapped up in it that like he's not having fun anymore, that he doesn't like he's not enjoying like the intellectual he's not in he's just kind of not as like thrilled with like the balance and kind of what's happening, or do you think that it couldn't be something that simple?
I mean, I won't say it couldn't be that, and you know, part of me, and this is why I brought this up earlier, part of me wouldn't be surprised if, you know, if he's trying to say, you know, is it sort of now or never? Should I fish or cut bait? And then you see a case where the fact that you've got this agency, you know, passing what seems to be a reasonable regulation in response to an emergency, and then the majority just sort of blows right through it. And he's helpless, right? He tried at oral argument, and he's helpless.
Yep.
Would it surprise me if he said, okay, now that's it? You know, no, it wouldn't surprise me at all. But I hesitate to say that he's not having fun anymore. I don't know that I see that much evidence that he's having less fun than he had in the past. I mean, he's a very serious person, but also a person who's very intellectually engaged. You know, I haven't seen signs that he is sort of less engaged at oral argument or not sort of interested in the cases, and you do see that with some justices, right? I mean, there is a history of people who are just checked out and aren't, you know, aren't participating in the way that they used to. I haven't seen that much with Justice Breyer.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, just even the way that Leah described him enjoying taking the clerks out and talking about all the cases and engaging with them. It seems, I guess what I mean by fun, it's not like he's necessarily joking around or taking his job lightly. It's just that he loves the intellectualness of it. And if he feels like he's being cheated of that, or there's less of it, it might strike me that he would be like, meh.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what's going on, you know, with him behind the scenes. You know, I will say, you know, he was the law clerks have had this tradition of having these weekly happy hours at the court. And Justice Breyer, at least when I was there, Justice Breyer was the only justice who would relatively consistently show up at these things. And so he would like to, it was in the middle courtyard of the court, and he'd sort of like to chat with the clerks and you know, it wouldn't surprise me. This is something we could investigate whether this still happens in COVID times, but you know, it wouldn't surprise me if, as someone who likes to kind of shoot the breeze with law clerks and get to know people, and that there's a coldness in the building that there wasn't before. I think people in lots of workplaces around the world have felt that. So it wouldn't surprise me if the place, like so many workplaces, is a less fun place than it used to be.
Well, we should get him on the show. This is like what we're all about here. Richard Wattenberger, great to see you. Go ahead.
Great to see you too. Great to see you, GDF and Jamal. So this question kind of piggybacks on Jack's question having to do with who would want to be on this court, and at least that's part of the motivation. What liberal would want to be on this court, rather. So my question is, in the history of the Supreme Court, how significant in general have dissents been for subsequent rulings and in the crafting of new legislation to address the undesirable consequences of a decision? And I have in mind here a strategic need for liberals to establish new rationales for policies to which the court has been averse, especially when conservatives hold the lopsided majority.
So I tend to think that, you know, if there's a case to be made for why a liberal would want to be on this court, it's in that space. There've been quite a number of, you know, historical dissents that have turned into majority opinions in later years or have turned into legislation. There's the Lilly Ledbetter Act, which was an equal pay act, was passed because of a dissent that Justice Ginsburg read from the bench in the early 2000s. So that's a prominent example. But there's also, you know, you lay the intellectual groundwork for what's going to happen when you're in the majority in dissenting opinions. And there's lots of historical examples of that as well. You know, we think about Justice Brandeis and the Fourth Amendment as a prime example, or Justice Harlan and his many dissents in constitutional cases. Justice Stevens had a number of dissents that ended up turning into majority opinions as well. Bowers versus Hardwick is an example of that. So it does happen, and and maybe connecting this question to the last point, you know, Justice Breyer is someone who has a very definite methodology for approaching cases, and he has laid that out in opinions, in majority opinions, in dissenting opinions, in numerous books, at oral argument, in lots of speeches, and you know, at some point you've sort of said what you've said your piece, right? And so for him, I can certainly see the case for saying, look, in dissent, all you have is your legacy, and I've already, you know, sort of done that. But for someone new to come on, I think that is the, you know, that is the promise, is even if you're dissenting for a long time, maybe you get the attention of Congress on something. Maybe it's a big platform, right? So you know, every law student is going to read your opinions in a big case if you make enough noise, and that's, you know, that's a big deal for trying to shape the law in the long term. It's very easy for me to think in this way as an academic. This is what we're always doing, is, you know, shaping the law for 100 years from now. But I think judges do that as well, at least at the level of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I was listening. Oh, go ahead, GDF.
Can I ask you what you think the effects will also be on jurisprudential thinking and like how people approach their own legal interpretation, especially students, and where you think that, yeah, I would just like to hear a little bit more.
In terms of Justice Breyer's effect?
Yes, because he spoke so much about the students in his when he was speaking today.
Well, I do think that there are opinions of Justice Breyer that I certainly hope are being assigned to people. As someone who is somewhat intellectually simpatico with Justice Breyer on a number of things, I think of his dissenting opinion in District of Columbia versus Heller, for example, which is this gun control case from 2008, and the main dissent's written by the Justice I clerk for Justice Stevens, and he writes an elaborate historical defense of the idea that the Second Amendment only applies in the militia context. And then Justice Breyer writes this dissent where he's sort of like, well, yeah, okay, I'll sign on to Justice Stevens' opinion, but what we really should be thinking about is, who cares if there's a right to bear arms? The question is, how far does it go? What kinds of regulations does it allow? Look at what has historically, we have to build out, what an originalist would call the construction of this particular right, rather than just thinking about it in an interpretive sense. And I think there's so much wisdom in that opinion. I do think, I think back to in the I think early 2000s, Dahlia Lithwick had this great line where she is comparing Justice Breyer to Justice Scalia, and says, Justice Scalia has all these pithy phrases and turns of phrase, and he's really charismatic in the way that he talks. Whereas for Justice Breyer to explain his ideology, it takes an hour on Charlie Rose, is what she said. And I think there's a lot to that, in that I don't know how successful Justice Breyer has been in reaching out to people in the same way, at least not in the same way that a Scalia did. He's got lots of books, and those books have quite a lot of wisdom in them. And so my hope is that in his retirement, there might be a re-engagement with some of his thinking, because I do think that there's a lot to say for his focus on facts, for his attention to institutional context, right? He's an old school. He's like an OG progressive.
And Linda Greenhouse wrote this. I don't know if you saw her op-ed, but this was essentially I took to be what she was saying in her op-ed, was that this
I thought she was retired. Great, she's back.
I know, right?
Unlike the Supreme Court.
I'm not. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, she's riding the circuit of the New York Times.
Sitting by designation. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Sitting by designation, just playing with us. I know. I was so sad when she wrote her last column. Now she's had like 3 since, I think that she can't let go. But yeah, she had this great column today that was just last night I think it came out, which was basically saying what you said, that an original kind of liberal in this sense. But do you think that has a reason, that he doesn't feel like he has that his voice has like a place anymore in kind of the new conservative, new progressive kind of balance? I mean, that wouldn't seem to phase. I wouldn't think that would phase him.
I doubt he thinks that. I think he's 83 years old, and the Democrats are going to lose the midterms probably. So, I mean, and he saw what happened with Justice Ginsburg, right? I mean, so I think those, he's reluctant to talk about it in these terms, in part because he does, I think, genuinely believe that in a very substantial majority of cases are not ideological in the way that we talk about them as being ideological, and I think he does want to hammer that home. But I think it's, I don't think this retirement is any more mysterious than it looks.
Yeah, I think that's right, and it actually is kind of one of the most straight. I think Dahlia Lithwick actually had something in the last day that said that this was kind of the most politically kind of expedient or like planned kind of retirements. It's just like very clear what's happening. It's like very clear, like they're giving plenty of time for it to happen. Like it's not a giant mystery. Charles, nice to see you. We've covered, I think we've kind of
you guys have all really kind of covered my question. It was mostly a matter of what opportunity does Breyer's replacement have to make an impact. The conventional wisdom is this isn't going to change the balance of the court, which I think is probably right. That being said, is it as meaningless as it appears on its face, or is?
Well, let me say this. Breyer did have a particular perspective on the law that I think is not quite. I mean, Kagan has some of it, but it's not quite. There's not quite another justice who's like him.
Are you speaking specifically about agencies, or admin?
I'm thinking about proportionality as a approach to thinking about rights. I'm thinking about foreign law. Justice Breyer was a very worldly justice, right? He would participate in this Yale Global Judges Conference for many years. He would be abroad a lot. He was fluent in French and would speak to French judges and hang out in Strasbourg and hear about the European Court of Human Rights and so forth. And he brought some of that into his judging. There's no one on the court today, now that Kennedy's gone, now that Breyer's gone, there's no one on the court today who's really focused on comparative jurisprudence. And by that, I don't mean he's bringing in foreign law in the way it's caricatured.
Yeah.
I mean that it just shapes the sort of opportunity set that he views when he looks at the law. And I think that's missing somewhat. I also think that he fairly transparently, for a justice, tried to kind of broker deals. I don't, it's hard to know when it actually worked or when it didn't work, right? But there are a couple of conspicuous instances of Justice Breyer joining surprising opinions in very closely contested cases. The NFIB versus Sebelius, the Obamacare case where he and Justice Kagan join an opinion striking down the Medicare expansion. Speaking of affirmative action, right? Grutter and Gratz, right? So the two Michigan cases, Justice Breyer and Justice O'Connor were the two people who were in the majority in both of those cases. And that you might have thought that was a little bit surprising, but if you're someone who says, look, we've got a narrow path here and there's two cases here, or there are two issues here, and I'm going to make sure that we hold on to the issue that really counts, and maybe trade that off for, I don't know if that's exactly what's happening, but that's what it looks like is happening. And I don't know whether his replacement will have those same instincts. Justice Kagan, I think, maybe has some of those instincts, but as one way to put it is, if this were a 6-3 progressive court, right? Justice Breyer would be the person who people on the conservative side were trying to capture.
Yeah, I mean, he was though. Like he was.
Roberts, right?
But was it? I mean, like you just said with like Grutter, like, and this is how I remember him. Is I remember him and O'Connor. I mean, I always that has always like changed forever. Changed my. That was the moment in which I realized kind of the wisdom of what Linda Greenhouse like wrote about, was just like that he was kind of like a capturable for a long time until the balance of the court changed.
And there's some
intellectual honesty about that.
Well, it's possible that, you know, if he was deal making, if it worked, and we don't know necessarily whether it did, but that matters. You know, if it takes just a little bit of statesmanship to hold on to a thin majority, and he certainly was someone who was willing to try to engage in that kind of statesmanship, and so we'll see what happens with the replacement.
So GDF, feel free to like ask less questions, but I did hear I see some bouncing of Luke happening, so I
apologize.
No, don't apologize. I am curious if you're optimistic about kind of whether this, with, you know, is there anyone that can kind of fill the O'Connor Breyer, I guess kind of Kennedy-esque, the middle-ish role anymore on the court? Will there be? Will this kind of result in a true, like, just like kind of like a constant polarization, or what do you think?
Well, I want to caution against thinking that the current reality is the permanent reality, and I know it does look that way, but life throws you a lot of curveballs, and I have no idea what the court will look like in 10 years, even though I can make a prediction, but I really don't know. There's no middle of the court in an O'Connor sense. Certainly, you know, I will say that with Justice O'Connor and with Justice Kennedy, when they became the swing justice, there's some evidence that their decisions became more moderate than they were before, and that makes some sense, right? If you have a certain ideology and you're, you know, throwing spitballs from the sideline, and then suddenly you're the decision maker, you know, you've got to pay a little bit more attention to the wages of your decisions, and there's some evidence that that's happened. Maybe that's happened a little bit with John Roberts, and it's a little bit hard to tell. And he certainly is the most the leftmost of the right side of the court, but he has 5 people to his right, and so you know, who is it? Is it Kavanaugh? Is it Barrett? You know, these are people who I do think have some desire to be viewed as people who are open to other views.
You think Barrett does? I mean, I guess like she hasn't even started, like, almost, like, I mean,
I mean, I don't want to speculate too much, but they're, you know, these are really conservative judges, right? And so I don't have any particular reason to think they're going to be anywhere near the kind of moderate that an O'Connor was.
Yes, but we even had, I believe it was Gorsuch. He's gone because of some decisions. I think Bostock was one where he sided with the liberals because of his intellectual.
Well, yes and no. I mean, he came out with you know, the outcome was an outcome that I think people on the left supported. So this is applying Title VII to sexual orientation and transgender status. But the way he got there was through a kind of aggressively formalist textualism that, in the case coming up, the Harvard affirmative action case, leads in only one direction, right? Which is there's no possibility of considering race in admissions for a recipient of federal funding. There's no doubt in my mind as to where Justice Gorsuch comes out in that opinion. So, you know, that the formalism sometimes giveth and often taketh away.
Yeah, well said. I think that's right. And Anita Krishnakumar was just on this, who's expert in textualism and statutory interpretation. She just moved to Georgetown from St. John's. She was on talking about Gorsuch's opinion on textualism in the OSHA case, and just kind of and so it's not like he's that is maybe going to be his kind of his, as it was before, going to continue to be his signature kind of like set of reasoning. on things. And I think I think you're completely right. I think you're completely right on the affirmative action cases. So generally, like, you're just like, we don't know what the court's gonna be like in the long term, in the next 10 years. Maybe we don't know what it's going to be like in the next 2 years. And so in that sense, kind of,
I'm more confident about that.
Yeah. I mean, well, I don't know. I was never expecting Scalia to suddenly die. I mean, yeah, I know. So, I mean, I think that was, yeah, exactly. He was nice. Yeah. But I think that generally that is, I mean, Clarence Thomas has health issues. Also, like, there's like a lot of stuff that could happen. I mean, that generally the court is remarkably young. But Sotomayor has health issues. And so there's certain types of things that you kind of think about. But yes, I mean, 2 to 10 years, like, a lot can happen. And yeah, I do think that I am interested. I think that what you just said is interesting about throwing spitballs from the sidelines, is how the writing and like the court generally moves when the shape of their colleagues moves around them. I think the context really does kind of it'll be interesting to see how much it changes or how much it doesn't. So
yeah, I mean, before Grutter versus Bollinger, Chandra Day O'Connor had never signed on to an opinion approving of race-conscious decision-making within the government. Before Fisher versus Texas, Anthony Kennedy had never done so. And when they became the decision maker, they seemed to become a bit more moderate. I don't have a lot of confidence that's going to happen in the next race-based affirmative action case.
Yeah.
But I do think, there's a lot of weight on the shoulders of the person who writes an opinion that says, we're going to fundamentally transform, some major segment of American life. I haven't seen a whole lot of hesitation so far in doing that. I mean, the vaccine case, for example, but we'll see.
Yeah. Well, Jamal, it was so great to see you. Thank you for coming on. GDF, I will let you just wave goodbye with Luke if you want to, but feel free to unmute yourself. But Jamal, thanks so much for coming on. We will be back tomorrow, probably with Cheese Night. It's unclear who our guest is, but we're not allowed to have fun anymore. But we are allowed to be like a little bit optimistic for the next kind of 6 months, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. And thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. This was completely joyless, so thank you.
Yeah, I know. Wow, you said that with such a straight face. I almost believed you for a second. Bye, guys.